For Diablo 4, Season 2, Season of Blood, I started with a Pulverize Druid, and oh boy does this bear smash everything on the screen. If you like big numbers from your overpower crits, don't want to have to worry too much about mandatory gear with only one aspect to get you started, and you want a starter build that can take you from shortly after level 1 all the way through to level 100, then look no further than Pulverize Druid. In short, I can sum up a build with super tanky, great clear, mediocre single target, but you can absolutely still kill the uber bosses. Though, if I was going to make a dedicated Lilith killer, this is not going to be the first thing I'd have in mind. And if you want to see what other druid builds I have in mind, do be sure to get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, and for now, let's get into the key mechanics. First up, Pulverize with Shockwave Aspect generates both a melee hit that AoEs around you, and also a massive shockwave that travels forwards across the screen. The shockwave is more than enough for trash clear, but on single target you're going to want to be hitting with your melee as well. So you want to be fairly close range to enemies. This means you can also take advantage of damage to close, a quite generous damage scaling stat. When you're fighting a boss or tanky single enemy, make sure you're double hitting. You can do this by seeing 2 numbers pop up when you hit Pulverize. If you see only 1 number, then you're probably a little bit too far away. Try getting a bit closer, or maybe on very rare occasions with super small hitbox enemies, you're slightly off to the side, you're a little bit too close. All sorts of weird stuff can happen on small hitbox enemies. On larger ones, like most bosses, it's pretty easy, just don't be super far away. The next mechanic I wanted to get into is Debilitating Roar. This is really handy because it reduces the damage enemies deal to you. It releases your souls, allowing you to AoE things down, and it slows everything in a massive AoE, sometimes going off the edge of your screen, which triggers Umbral and can completely refill your spirit. So you should save Debilitating Roar either till A, you think you're going to get hit by a spooky mechanic, or B, until you run out of spirit, then just trigger it, AoE everything, and there you go, free resources. Now for Season 2, Blizzard did reduce the duration of crowd control effects on you, yay! But I can't be too excited because crowd control is still really annoying. So this build has 3 sources of Unstoppable: Trample, Earthen Bulwark, and Grisly Rage. Trample's pretty self-explanatory, you're unstoppable while trampling. Earthen Bulwark is used more as a CC break retroactively, and Grisly Rage makes you immune to all CC for a short duration. If you feel like you're getting CC to death too frequently, you can also take the Metamorphosis Vampiric power. Just remember that means you have to evade through enemies to put your Vampiric curse on them. Something else that's really important to this build is Fortify. Not only is it a defense, but it helps to scale your overpower damage. So not only do you want to have Fortify, but you want to be fortified, which means using things like Vasily's Prayer to ensure your Fortify is equal to or greater than your current life. And since both Life and Fortified Life scale overpower damage, and this is an overpower build, I chose to invest into Hemomancy. It's a massive AoE. It heals you and feels absolutely incredible. I really couldn't imagine playing a build without Hemomancy, at least in the Season of Blood. And then the last key mechanic I wanted to talk about is, why do you want the damage to crowd controlled stat? Is it simply a good damage scaler? I mean, it's fine, but damage to slowed or damage to close would be better. However, Earthen Devastation gives you a multiplicative damage multiplier based on your damage to crowd controlled enemies. So you'll at least want enough, which can usually be done by wearing a staff, having damage to crowd controlled on a staff and damage to crowd controlled on a ring, to be able to max out the bonus. After that, it's not a particularly good stat, and you should probably avoid further sources of it. With that said, let's get into things and start talking about the skills, Paragon board, Spirit Boons, Vampiric powers, gear, and of course, moving on to the gameplay after that. So to start off with, grab Earth Spike. This is not only a ranged generator, but it's also an Earth and Werebear skill. This is important because you'll need to be able to have a Werebear skill to be able to use it during Grisly Rage. Otherwise, you'd be stuck with Maul, which isn't nearly as good and isn't ranged. And of course, you can go with Wild Earth Spike for damage, or if you're struggling on Fortify, you could go Fierce Earth Spike, but I don't particularly recommend it. Next up, Pulverize. This is the build's main damage source, so you should max it as early as possible. The damage bonus from Raging Pulverize really isn't all that worth it. You can do some damage to stun stuff, but trust me, just go with Primal for the defensive bonus. 20% reduced damage for 4 seconds is really good, and enemies will almost always have the debuff up. Early on, I didn't put all these points in. I just grabbed Predatory Instinct and moved on. Over here, Earthen Bulwark with Preserving Earthen Bulwark. Let's just take a moment and have a second of silence for Earthen Bulwark build that got completely nerfed into the ground in Season 2. Moving on, grab Ancestral Fortitude early. That way you have resistance cap more easily. And of course, take Debilitating Roar with Innate Debilitating Roar. It needs to apply that slow, otherwise you're not going to get all of a really nice Umbral procs. Then we skip Companions. Early on, level 1 to 30-ish, I really heavily got carried by Poison Creeper. Also grabbed the other Companions just to do an all-companion build and have a ton of passive damage, but it falls off hard around level 30. I respect to Pulverize and never looked back. And then Trample, it's a pretty good movement skill and has a relatively short cooldown. Of course, Savage Trample so it generates Spirit. Optionally, you can take a point in Safeguard. Critical strikes with Earth skills will fortify you for 2% of base life. Personally, I found that my Fortify was staying up the entire time without it. I've kind of gone back and forth though. Sometimes I do have it and sometimes I don't. I'd suggest experiment a little bit and go with whatever feels good to you. Then coming down here, of course, you need Grizzly Rage and you might as well fill it out with Supreme Grizzly Rage. You'll also want Ursine Strength for the 20% additional max health, since you're going to be permanently in Werebear form. And while healthy, you deal 25% increased damage and 25% increased overpower damage, which should stack multiplicatively. So 1.25 times 1.25 is, of course, 1.025, because Blizzard math. But you know, for the rest of us that don't subscribe to Blizzard math, it's 1.56, or 156% of normal damage on an overpower while you're healthy. Though, as a small note, I didn't do a ton of testing to confirm this. I just kind of smacked a couple enemies and said, yeah, that number looks pretty big. Feel free to correct me down in the comments if this is in fact incorrect. Then, most of the rest of my points went over here to fill out the extra damage bonuses. These days, there aren't that many damage multipliers available to characters, so you should pick up passives that give them, denoted by the little X, as much as you're able. Next up, Glyphs and Paragons. You won't necessarily have all of the points that I do, since I'm on a level 100 character, but it should be fairly obvious which things are optional. Like this. It's really good, it adds life and damage, but it's also quite a lot of points that you don't strictly need. Same with filling in the extra life node here. It's good, but not mandatory. Whereas if you don't take Tenacity, then you're not getting anywhere on the rest of your board. So to start off with, on the starting board, I have Territorial. Damage to close is really good, and gaining a damage reduction against close enemies makes me tankier against bosses. Moving on, my second board is Ancestral Guidance, and I do take the Legendary node, since a lot of them are actually genuinely useful now. I have Outmatch Socketed for the increased physical damage to non-elites and bosses, plus the 100% bonus to rare nodes in range. This means you get a whole lot of resistances and some willpower plus core skill damage. The third board is Inner Beast. This is mostly a pathing board where you'll socket Earth and Sky. 10% multiplicative damage to crowd-controlled or vulnerable enemies. Everything you hit at all times should be either crowd-controlled, vulnerable, or both. And you also get a little bit of extra damage and armor from the magic nodes the Glyph enhances. Be sure to come over here for Nimble as soon as you can. This build doesn't get a ton of attack speed, so it's a fairly powerful damage multiplier. The fourth board is Earthen Devastation, a very important board for the build. Because my gear isn't optimized, I'm missing 9% damage here. I would need more damage to crowd control, specifically a roll on my weapon, and I'd be able to solve that. But until then, it is slightly unoptimized. If you're looking for points to cut by the way, Suffused Resilience, not terrible, but not the greatest. You can cut most of these and pick up like a 1.5% resist node, and it should be pretty darn close if you're tight on points. Do be sure to come up here to get Oppressed, though. That one's pretty good. And of course, you want everything in radius of your Werebear glyph for not only the damage reduction, but damage while in Werebear form, because you should always be in Werebear form. Then the fifth board is Survival Instincts. While in Werebear form, you deal multiplicative increased damage up to 50% for every 1% difference in current life percent between you and the enemy. In other words, if you have 50% more life in the enemy, you deal 50% more damage to them. Pretty good deal. I have the exploit glyph, so everything I hit becomes vulnerable, and then I maintain further vulnerability through the Vampiric curse. RIP vulnerable damage, it used to be so good, but now you kind of just grab things, focus on the defensive nodes, and move on to the last board, which is Constricting Coils. Here we're taking fairly minimal nodes. These are all optional, you can drop them if you need points, but do be sure to socket Fang and Claw and allocate 40 willpower within the radius. That way you get the very nice bonuses on Courage and Nature's Will. I've honestly gone back and forth on this board and strongly considered moving it up in the chain so that I can get the extra 4% increased max life, but it just hasn't quite fit, and it is only 4% life, so it's not the biggest deal, even if it is quite nice. The main issue of moving it up is it would have to be 4th in the chain, it can't be 5th, and then I'd have to worry about dealing with extra pathing nodes, as these boards are relatively efficient. So I'm going to be experimenting with that in the near future, and if there are any updates, then I'll update the planner in Discord, but I probably won't be updating the video. I very recently hit level 100, so I've been kind of messing around with my board a lot, and unfortunately, the only way to try something like this is to respec everything. But I think there's a fairly decent way on Constricting Coil to path out either this way or this way. There isn't too many more points than this, since I don't think you need anything past the willpower node. And so ultimately, it might be worth it bumping this all the way to 6th, since most of the bonuses aren't active anyway. I lose 3% all resistance, but with high enough item power on my jewelry, and of course enough intelligence, I can easily make up for that, no trouble at all. Though if I got an all stats roll, I guess I'd enable all these, in which case it might not be ideal. Again, kind of going back and forth on that, haven't decided for sure. Everything else I'm pretty set on. There are certainly enough spare points, like over here and over here, where if I did change my mind and needed just a couple extra, I'd be able to find the points without having to rework everything. Next up, here are the spirit boons I'm using on the build. First up, we have Wariness. Take 10% reduced damage from elites. This damage reduction is great because it works on many of the game's most dangerous enemies. Next up, Scythe Talons. If you wanted to spirit bond something that isn't Snake, you could actually go with Iron Feather as well, but if you can only get one, I'd go with Scythe Talons for the 5% crit chance. This build's a little bit crit starved. Coming down to Wolf, Calamity is the easy choice for extending the duration of ultimate skills. Obsidian Slam is of course a shoo-in as well. Now for me, Snake is bonded, so I also have Calm Before the Storm, but I don't have very much lucky hit on my gear, and so I'm kind of thinking I should just go over to Iron Feather. I have pretty good ult uptime on Grizzly Rage anyway. The cooldown gets reduced by a Vampiric power, so even though this is quite good, it's not up very frequently for me, and I'd kind of rather just have the extra life sometimes. This is going to very much depend on what content I'm doing. This procs a ton on trash. This, on the other hand, would be more effective on a single target, where I'm not going to get those ult procs. And speaking of Vampiric powers, here's what I'm using. First up, Hemomancy, because I'm going to be honest, I don't think I would play any build this season without Hemomancy. Getting 80% of your life as physical damage in a massive AoE is great, especially in a build that stacks life, and you get healing, which means in those Nightmare 100s or any area with high density, I'm absolutely destroying everything, plus doing a ton of damage. Next up, Ravenous. Lucky hit, chance to increase attack speed by 40% of my total move speed, so it's about 50% attack speed, which is really strong. This is also a contender for one of the best Vampiric powers. Then, Prey on the Weak, deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies, and enemies are vulnerable while affected by Vampiric Curse, which is why I also have Accursed Touch. Lucky hit, up to 44% chance to inflict Vampiric Curse and spread it. I've found on bosses this is up 100% of the time, because it doesn't seem like the Vampiric Curse has a duration. So you hit them enough, they get cursed, and, well, it's going to last for the rest of their life. Last up, Anticipation. Ultimate skills gain cooldown reduction, and ultimate skills deal 12% increased damage for each nearby enemy affected by your damage over time effects. This isn't a dot build. I tried Constricting Coils to add the dot stuff. It didn't really feel worth it, though I may experiment again. For now, let's just say this is 20% ult cooldown, which is honestly plenty on Grizzly Rage, feels really good, and absolutely justifies the slot. Though there are a couple alternatives if you really wanted. For example, you can use Blood Boil. When your core skills overpower, you get the blood drops, which you can pick up, dealing a pathetic amount of damage, but it is a guaranteed overpower every 20 seconds, which feels pretty good while clearing. Or alternatively, you could get Sanguine Brace. I tried it a bit, and ultimately it didn't feel impactful enough to keep, especially over something like Anticipation. And of course, last but not least, the gear. For your helmet, use Vasili's Prayer. This gives you a lot of quality of life because now you can use Earth skills while in Werebear form. Plus, it's a really good way to maintain your Fortify. This is great because you get both Earth and Bulwark while in bear form, and also Earth Spike. The build feels really bad without these, so I very much suggest prioritizing it. Well, okay, it doesn't feel the worst, but then you have to go into melee to generate resources, which can just be awkward when you're used to playing at range. So I'd recommend Vasili's as early as you can get it. Insatiable Fury, on the other hand, Werebear form is now your true form, feels really, really good, gives you a ton of armor in Werebear form, but it's not required. If you don't have it, it's not the end of the world. I would farm for it if you don't have it, especially once you're in endgame, but early on you can play the build once you get the Shockwave aspect without these uniques. For your gloves, the most important stat is ranks to Pulverize. I honestly went back and forth here on the other stats. I think crit chance is absolutely mandatory as the build is quite crit starved. Attack speed is quite good, could be lucky hit chance. Willpower is quite good, could be lucky hit chance, could also be all stats. I tried chance to restore resource, didn't have enough lucky hit to make that work, but I've had pretty bad luck with lucky hit gear, at least so far. Then on pants, get defensive stats. Things like life, armor, damage reduction. These pants aren't very good. The 2 armor rolls are solid, the life is useful, the damage reduction from poisoned isn't actually useful. So I'm kind of using a 3-mod item, but also I can clear Nightmare 100s with a 3-mod item. So I guess gear just doesn't really matter all that much in D4 anymore. And for Legendary Aspect, you can either go with a Might aspect like I have, or the Disobedience aspect. Disobedience would be if you are below the armor cap, which is 13,200. Right now, because I'm in town, you can't really see it, but if I go out of town, then this will jump up to slightly over, and I'll show that later. On boots, the most important stat to get is movement speed. The second most is spirit cost reduction. After that, willpower's damage. You can get resistances here if you need them to cap. You can even get some all stats, but overall boots are one of the less important slots. Just remember to imprint them with quicksand. Now your weapon's a really important slot. Higher item power is generally better. It must be a staff. And if you can find it, it's really nice to have the damage to crowd-controlled enemies as an explicit stat, which unfortunately I don't have. This is something like 6 million to reroll now, so I'm probably not going to get it. But the next staff that I drop that has it, I'm definitely swapping to immediately. The crit damage and all that, that's cool. Having the damage to crowd-controlled enemies would be 9% more multiplier, and it would more than make up for having other mediocre damage increases as long as the other stats of the weapon did actually apply to my build. Something else that would be big is getting, instead of willpower, all stats, since that would enable a lot more things across the Paragon boards. Make sure to put your Shockwave aspect on the weapon to double its effect. Then for Amulet, spirit cost reduction is really good. Try to get 3 ranks in a useful passive. Make sure to imprint Retaliation. Aside of that, movement speed's good, cooldown reduction's good. Any sort of damage reduction, armor stat, also good. Damage is okay. For rings, you will want one of them to be Umbral. The other can be either Ursine Horror or Rampaging Werebeast. Doesn't really matter, it's completely interchangeable between gloves and ring. You want life on both. Generally speaking, you will want damage to crowd controlled on one, you'll want crit chance on both, and then ideally damage to close enemies as that's the next best stat. Lucky hit chance is also pretty available on rings and not that hard to get. I just happened to go with the crit ones because if I only had lucky hit on one ring, it wouldn't be that impactful, so I decided to drop it from the build entirely. I did experiment with it for a while and it seemed fine, but I genuinely didn't notice when I dropped it, so I don't think it's super important to have. If you get it, that's great. And if you don't get it, just use a damage roll. It's fine. Now, one major change about Diablo 4, in comparison to the previous seasons, is there's certain stats that aren't necessarily mandatory, but you really want. So, if you can get armor cap at 13,200, get armor cap. This is based on things like the total armor while in Werebear form, or wearing higher item power items for higher innate armor rolls. The other thing that you really want capped or very close to it are your resistances. This can be done either by getting single resistance rolls on items. Vasilis takes care of lightning, so you'll want to focus on cold, poison, shadow, fire. Or, of course, by stacking all resistances through things like diamonds or the Paragon boards. Don't be afraid to use a single resistance gem if that helps you get all your resistances capped. Unfortunately, ring implicits can be useful for this, but mine aren't. So I'm at 69.9, which I guess is a pretty nice resistance to be at, for fire, poison, and shadow. If I got a little bit more int, maybe an all stats roll somewhere, those would go up to 70 and it would be totally fine. And so, what about the gameplay? Well, you can absolutely smash bossless dungeons. And if enemies are in a fairly linear area, such as corridors like the Sirocco Cavern, plus high density, you'll completely sustain your spirit between spirit on kill and also the spirit on hit from the umbral aspect. In general, I would look for dungeons that have high density, linear layouts, and no boss, like the Sirocco Cavern. But the only time while clearing that I feel like I'm in danger is when I come up against a suppressor or a poison enemy. Poison just does a lot of damage, and suppressor's a massive pain. So I'll either use a poison flask or a life flask, because having the extra 20% maximum life not only scales my defenses, but it also scales my damage as well. And just to be clear, this reflects my experience so far. I'm not saying you're wrong for using Lucky Hit Chance. In fact, in better gear, it could very well be optimal. But a lot of my gear, as you saw from the gearing section, is pretty scuffed, so I decided to prioritize Critical Strike Chance as that's what felt better. Ultimately, I think there's a lot of ways to build this character, and I think Pulverize Druid is quite strong even when it's not fully optimal, which is something that I very much wanted to showcase, as this was my season starter, and so the ability to get going on nothing and scale into the endgame is quite important. Bosses are doable. For example, this is me fighting Uberduriel, and as you can see, I can face tank everything he does, but it's also going to be slow in comparison to a lot of other Druid builds. This build is a great AoE farmer that functions on very little gear, but it's not the single best thing when it comes to endgame bosses. I guess every build does have to have a weakness. But hey, it's also really good for beginners since I was able to face tank most things. And in that regard, it really was a great starter build. Things were a little bit slow to start, but after I got a 9-10 plus staff, Vasilis, and Insatiable, it absolutely took off. I had a blast, got all the way to 100, leveled up a bunch of my glyphs, though I haven't quite maxed them out, almost completed the season journey, killed all the new bosses, including Uberduriel. Unfortunately, I did not get an Uber Unique from him, RIP. And I'm in a perfect position to farm for any other build, either on Druid, or maybe prepare for a different class if that's what I want to play next. And if you want to play Pulverize Druid but feel like you need a little bit more help, then there's a complete guide written by Boiler over at MaxRollGG. I'll also link to that down in the description. On the other hand, if you just want a handy quick reference, then head over to my Discord where I'll have the D4 planner with my character mostly. I'm probably going to change some of the really bad rolls on items to what they really should be, but aside of that, it's going to be the gear that I have, not necessarily a perfect optimized thing, and you can find that over on Discord. But now I'm curious, what have you been playing in Diablo 4 Season of Blood? And if you've killed Uberduriel, have you gotten yourself an Uber Unique yet? Be sure to let me know which one it is, or if you've gotten one, down in the comments below. If you're looking for something else to watch, maybe you're a little bit confused about an aspect of the seasonal mechanic, then do be sure to check out my full Season of Blood guide, which I'll link up in the card and down below. But with that said, thanks for watching. A special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Link to that is down below. And now, with that said, thank you again for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.